Okay, so in this session, we're going to take a look at watering, and one of the reasons why is probably one of the most common questions on different forums is about watering. When to water, how much to water, and my point here, and sorry you can't see much of me because I want to focus on the trays, is the answer to those questions is almost always it depends. And it may seem like a bit of a cop-out, but usually those questions don't come accompanied with enough information to really give somebody an informed answer, because there's so many factors to consider when you're looking at water. So what I'm going to do in this session is I have three different types of trays. I have one with my regular soil in it here. Here I have one with perlite in it and another one with vermiculite in it. So my soil mix is a combination of peat. This one is a perlite mix, maybe a few other things in there, and these are just straight vermiculite and perlite. And different soil mixes have different combinations of these components, but they're usually the key things you would see in a soil mix. So there's a lot of stuff to consider in each of those components. One of them is the individual characteristics of each component in terms of how they react with water and how they react with air. The other thing is the particle size in those components, and that would go for both vermiculite and perlite as well as peat, which can come in different grades, and really it's about the particle size in each of those. So what we're going to look at here is each of these three trays and how they absorb water, and then I've actually got a tray of growing sunflower shoots here, which we're going to water as well. So one of the main questions that people ask is whether you should be watering from the top overhead or whether you should be watering from the bottom. And once again, this depends a lot, but there's advantages to both. Now, I tend to do watering at some points in the cycle with sunflower from above and some from below. And the reason I do that is because each one has its advantage. So I generally prefer to water crops from above early in the cycle, especially for the hardier ones. And a big reason there is it's a way of sort of cleansing them off after a 4 or 5 day germination period. And then with some crops, I really like to water them overhead near the end of their cycle. And that's so I'm actually giving them a good washing before harvest. And that's especially important for crops that are going to go right from harvest into a package and aren't going to get a water bath or a spin. So you need to know the characteristics of each of your crops to know when the best time to do each of those things is. Another thing to consider is knowing what your crop's tendency is in terms of holding water. And the example I give for this one a lot is with radish. And radish is a crop that once it gets wet, it's really hard to get dry again. So it's a crop, for example, that on the day it gets uncovered, it gets an overhead water. It might get one the day after, but then it doesn't get any more overhead watering at all. And that way, when it goes into harvest time, it's very, very dry, and it's really easy to cut that and package it right away. Something like pea shoots, well, if you've ever watered pea shoots from above, they tend to shed water really well. So there's not really a big concern with them holding water because they dry out naturally very quickly. And then something like sunflower, it's often inconsequential because they really benefit from a water bath, not only for cooling them down, but for picking the hulls off. So chances are you're going to be giving them water anyways, and so overhead watering doesn't matter. However, when you get into the more delicate crops, often overhead watering can knock them over, create disease problems, and some of them can hold the water quite well also. So those are ones that are really good from watering from below. Now there's an art to doing both of those things, and my general suggestion is just do it lots and pay attention. It's one of those things you get better at with practice, like anything. So we're going to take a look here at doing some bottom watering for these crops, or for these trays, as well as for this sunflower crop. So what I'm using for a tray here is this, it's like a boot tray you can get at Home Depot. And I really like it because it's just a really good size for fitting a tray into. And I'm going to start here with my tray of potting mix. And so this is the base soil that I use for all my home production right now. It's the Organic Veggie Mix, Organic Veggie Pro Mix. It's OMRI certified, so this is something you could use for certified organic production. And so when I'm watering here, I'm putting water in the tray below. And I'm really going to fill this tray up as high as it will go. just really to the edge. And you can kind of see how it is there. And it's not likely that this soil is going to absorb all this water, but it's going to absorb a lot. And so by having it really close to the edge, to the top edge, it really allows me to watch the water level go down. So we can do a little bit more here. Okay, so now what's happening here is the water is basically, our trays have holes in them, as all your trays should. That's a topic for another time. Now what's going to happen is, because the soil is dry, water tends to move along a continuum, which means it's going to move from areas where there's lots of water to areas where there's less water. So when you have something dry like this and it's in contact with water, by nature the water is going to move up into it. And what it's doing is moving along the surface of the components in here, and in some cases in between the fibers. So that would be the case with all our components of perlite, vermiculite, and peat, because they all have that a kind of a fibrous texture, but in just a different way. So different components are going to absorb water at different rates, which we can take a look at as well. So this is a soil mix that was fairly dry, and I usually have just enough water in there so that when I'm preparing it for seeding or preparing it in the tray, it's not dusty and I don't have dust flying up everywhere, and it's just enough to get sort of compacted in here enough that it's nice and smooth and easy for seeding. So when I'm doing something like this, I'm watching for two things. I'm watching the water level as it goes down, and generally the drier your, to a degree, the drier your soil, the quicker it's going to go down. However, when a soil is very, very, very dry, it tends to get hydrophobic, which means it's going to repel water. So in that case, it might take a little bit longer for the water to start working its way up into the soil. So this is something over time you'll start to notice. And one of your main indicators of how much water is in your soil at any time is you actually picking up the tray as you're going through your production. And so you kind of know how heavy a tray is when you fill it with soil originally. You kind of know how heavy a tray is when you lay it down to seed. You kind of know how heavy a tray is after you've seeded it and watered it, and you're picking it up for germination, to put it into germination. You kind of know how heavy a tray is when you've just watered it and it's fully grown and you need to move it somewhere. So you should really have a sense of the weight of your tray with different levels of water in it, just from working with the soil a lot. So as this is going, I can see down here that the water's really, really getting absorbed really well. It may not be as easy to tell from your end, but I can tell that it's getting really, really well soaked up, because there's these ridges in the bottom and they're starting to stick up above the water. My table's also a little imbalanced, so it ends up that there's a little more water on one side than the other. So there's two things I'm looking for here, as I talked about. One is I'm watching the tray. I can see the water's gone, and I'm pretty sure it hasn't just evaporated into the air, and thus it's going into the soil. So the second thing I'm often looking for here is watching for wetness on the soil surface. So what that means is the water has already worked its way up from the bottom and up onto the soil surface. And it's really easy to notice when you're working with a tray without any seeds or any microgreens growing on it. But I also watch for that when I'm growing my trays, and I tend to just watch around the edges. Because of the plastic on the edge, the water tends to be able to work its way up fairly well that way. Another thing you might do is put your hand on it, and sometimes you can just start to feel wet spots. And I'm not actually feeling that yet, but I know we're getting there fairly quickly. Now there's going to come a point when you're going to be like, okay, I need to pick this thing up. I think it's absorbed enough water. And after doing that many, many times, you're going to pick it up sometimes and you're going to go, oh, like that doesn't feel like enough water. I know when I felt a tray like this, it's not been enough water and there's been problems. So these are things you just need to start noticing over time. And this applies whether you're watering from below or watering from above. So I can see that this is starting to soak up this water really well. And because the soil was fairly dry, and right here I can start to feel it coming up. There's a little divot here where I can start feeling it. And I imagine I'm going to start seeing it in the middle as well. So what that means is probably most of this water is fairly moist, or soil's fairly moist. It just hasn't worked its way quite to the surface yet. Now in this situation, this would be really good if there was something growing in there, because we want the roots to get the water down at the bottom. We're not worried about surface water. But if this was a tray for germination, I would primarily be watering from the top, because I want to make sure that most of the water is in that top aspect of the soil. And I also don't want too much water in the soil. I don't want it totally saturated. So it's really drying up on this end of the tray here. So I'm actually going to put a bit more water in here. It's not going to soak all of it up, but I just want to make sure there's lots in there. I can start to see now some wet spots. It's very wet here, very wet here. I'm sure it's going to start showing up in the middle there. So this tells me, I'm seeing a bit here as well. So this tells me that the water is being absorbed very, very well. But my main indicator is going to be when I pick up this tray and feel the weight of it. And over time, sometimes you're going to pick up a tray and go, oh, that's a really heavy tray. And often it's because your water, it's too saturated. It means every single bit of pore space in there is actually filled with water. So this is looking pretty good. I'm seeing little bits of water coming up to the surface. I don't need it super saturated, so I'm going to lift it out. Now, one thing you're going to notice here is there's not a whole lot of water dripping out of here. And this is because the peat moss has a really, really, really good water holding capacity. That's what it does. And already it's stopped dripping, and there's, this is a fairly saturated soil. Now, it is going to continue. You can actually see some of the wet spots there, some around here and up around the top here. And that water will continue to move and kind of evenly distribute itself throughout the soil, because that's what water does. So we will see some more water on the surface there. So that's our experience with our regular soil. And even as I'm talking, I can see it's getting much more moist on top. Now in reality, I'm feeling that tray. It's quite heavy. It's almost too heavy. There's too much water in there, which means all the pore space in between each of the soil components is filled with water, which means there's no air in there. And even though we think about plants absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen, the roots themselves actually respire. So they need oxygen in the root zone. So you need to have some pore space with air and some pore space filled with soil. So this is just a general soil principle and water principle to keep in mind. So now we're going to shift over to perlite. And I'm just going to pop the perlite in here. So I would never really do this. I don't grow anything in just perlite. I'm going to put a little more water in here as I talk. And I've actually got it so it's like not as deep here and then gets really deep here, so it's the same depth of the soil. And I'm doing that because then I can already see right here the water coming up. And this is a way I can kind of see the gradient. So I haven't done this experiment in years, but this is the sort of thing that I did in the early days of setting up my system. It's something I did in my degree of soil science. And so you really learn to observe these things, which we're often just talking about conceptually or theoretically. So I like to set it up so I can see that. And already I can see this is quite wet. Now when we think about perlite and vermiculite in our soil mixes, these are very, very low density materials, which are really, really good for holding pore space in there and creating air and lightness in our soil. So we think of them as holding air space. But as we can see here, and this is already quite wet right here, they also absorb water. Because they're dry, the water is moving into them and is being adsorbed onto the surface of the perlite, as well as in the sort of crystal interior as well. Now perlite is a volcanic rock, and it's heated, and when it's heated it kind of expands and creates the structure. And its density reduces by about 8 times, so it's very, very light. And so this is a really nice way to add lightness to our soil, and it also is going to add some drainage capacity as well as the ability to hold water. So there's an interesting concept within soil of needing to hold enough water but not too much. And if you've experimented with different soils, you'll find that there are different soil types that end up holding way, way too much water. As an example, soils high with mushroom manure the mushroom manure holds water too well. It can actually become anaerobic and cause disease problems. So we can see here, this is still quite wet. I'm not seeing yet here, same thing, anything on the surface. So if I press down, I can start to feel little bits of that water peeking through. So another thing you can see here is there's different sized particles here. Some of these are quite big, and others are quite small, and there's even little bits of dust in there. And here now I'm starting to feel some water at the surface there, and so I can tell this is getting absorbed in there very well. When we have clumps of bigger particles, like I actually do at the end here, the water is not going to absorb as well because there's big spaces between each of the particles. Whereas when the particles are smaller, the water can kind of jump between the particles in those spaces. So the size and grade of your perlite or vermiculite are going to actually have an influence on how much they help absorb the water and how much they help drainage. So this has gotten pretty moist on top already, which is pretty good. You can see that's happened quite a bit quicker than with our soil mixture here, which still, if we go back to that, you can see a lot more of the water working its way to the surface there. So that water is still continuing to move. So with this one, I see a good amount at the surface as well. So you see that happen quite quickly. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift this out of here. And as I do that, we can see that a lot of this water drains off. So this is the water that's sort of being held in between each particle. Now a lot of the water is going to be held within each particle, so within the sort of what we would call the micropore space. But the macropore space, or the big pore space between each of the particles, is letting its water go. And this is actually a condition we really like in soils called field capacity, where the big pores have some air in them, but the micropores have a lot of the water in them. So we can see, and this will actually drain for quite a while, but you can see it's slowed down quite a bit. My shoulders are getting sore, so I'm going to put this down. So we can see how that sort of moved through that soil. But, so that you see how it's absorbed that water, but how easily it releases it. So now you should be thinking about how this perlite is going to work with the peat in order to make a nice soil. And I'll say, like, this would apply to coir as well, which is very similar structure to peat, but each of them is going to react a little bit differently, and you're going to find different lots, like one you bought this year and one you bought 2 years ago may act a bit differently, and there's just lots of different factors that could play into that. So it's good to get to know each of your different lots of soil, just like it's good to get to know your different lots of seed. Okay, so now we're going to put the vermiculite in here, and already, like right away, this starts getting absorbed into there. I can see it very quickly. Now vermiculite, I mentioned perlite is a volcanic rock. Vermiculite is a type of clay, and clays come in many different types with many different structures, but at a chemical level, and already a lot of the water is gone here, it's all been sucked up very quickly. On a microscopic chemical level, clay is kind of made in these layers, and it's between those layers that the water is held, but also nutrients are held between those layers really well. And when we talk about a soil's or anything's ability to hold nutrients like that, what we're talking about is often the positively charged nutrients or the cations, and this is primarily calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And so what happens is with the water being held there, clays do a really good job of holding that mineral content as well. And those are very important minerals for growth. So this is really quickly absorbing this water. So I'm going to put this back in here. Now this is one of the characteristics of vermiculite, is it does absorb and adsorb water very quickly. So when we talk about absorption with a B, it's going into something, and adsorption with a D is on the surface of something. Okay, so I'm going to just put the rest of this water in here. Already I can see lots of wetness on the soil here. So it's moving through there very quickly. Another thing that you might notice about the vermiculite is it's a bit of a finer particle. And so it's much finer than these bigger chunks of perlite, which you can see here just by comparison. So hopefully you can see that anyways. I can see here on the video, you can see how wet it is in here. You can see how quickly it's gone up to the surface there. So water is moving very, very quickly through there and held on very well. And vermiculite is used for a lot of different, like, you can grow things in it in a hydroponic system as well, because it has, once again, this very good water holding capacity, but also releases it very well. So it's still coming in, but what we're going to do is same thing. We're going to lift this out of here. And we can see that a lot of this water is draining out here. So once again, this is a lot of the water that was in the macropores, the space in between the different particles. But I can also feel that this tray still has a lot of weight to it. It's much heavier than the perlite tray. So it's holding the water much, much better, but also doing a very, very good job of letting it go. So I've always had a preference towards vermiculite, mostly because of its high cation exchange capacity, or its ability to hold those positively charged nutrients. But ideally, probably a good soil is a mixture of both. And that's just something over time you're going to need to determine what's going to work best for your system. I've made some soil recommendations in the past, so I won't get into those mixes here. So that's pretty much done there. We'll stack that to the side. So I wanted to show you that to give you an example of how these different components of a soil work, but really this is something you should be doing on your own. The next part of this would really be like getting in here and kind of digging in to see what it's like. Like this is kind of like sand on a beach, and if I was to start squeezing it more and breaking up these particles, they would actually start acting more and more like a clay, which means holding on really, really tightly to that water and not letting it go. And even just squeezing it, I can start to feel that sort of slipperiness that we associate with clay. So we've looked at those components. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to water my growing crop here. So I'm just going to take this and pop it right into here. This is day 6, I believe, of this crop, maybe day 7. It's been a really, really nice crop. And this one is taking a lot of water. And this is what I mean by like sort of each circumstance is very particular. I'm growing these in a very contained area. They have a heat mat underneath, which really promotes growth, but also is going to cause the water to evaporate off the soil surface quicker. It's going to cause slightly quicker growth, which means transpiration through the leaves is going to happen quicker. And we've got a fluorescent light up here. Now fluorescent lights don't give off a lot of heat, but when the light is only a couple inches from the top of your crop, what it is doing is creating a little bit of a microclimate. And so between those two factors, the heat mat and the light, I've got a situation here where because of the extra heat and because of the more rapid growth, we are going to see much more, the soil use up the water a lot quicker. So that's something I need to sort of keep in mind when watering. I'll just run out, I've got a bit more here. Now at this point I might actually do some overhead watering as well. I really like it for rinsing off the crops, but because I know I'm going to give this a really good rinse afterwards, I'm not too worried about that. And as I talked about with the soil before, one of the things I'm going to do here when I'm sitting here is I'm going to watch as the water gets absorbed, but I'm also going to watch around the edges to see when it's sort of coming up there and getting to the surface. At this point, I'm not too worried about overwatering, even though it is possible, because these are growing so quickly between transpiration from the plant and evaporation from the soil surface, which will be reduced because of the cover here. The water will move through there fairly quickly. Just over time, I just have a sense of how long to leave it and what that's going to look like. If I'm unsure, what I do is I lift the tray while it's in here. I kind of give it a lift and go like, oh, is that heavy enough? And just from carrying, you know, tens of thousands of trays, it's really easy to tell when that water is at a good enough level. This is at a point in the crop's life where it's rapidly growing. There's much more organic matter here, so it's actually going to be transpiring much more. So it's going to be actually taking up water at a faster rate than it was yesterday and the day before. So I know it can take a lot of water here. So as it is, it's done a pretty good job here. I can actually see the water moving into it up at the front. But I think I'm starting to see a little bit at the soil here. The soil and almost a little bit of pooling right here, and the tray was feeling almost good there previously. So this is going to come out of here. Now I'm lifting it up. Very little drainage here like we saw with the other soil, just a little bit of sort of residual water, and back it goes. Now some days I might just take the watering can and just water it from here. Same thing. The reason I like that is because it gives them a bit of a wash, and I think it actually with some crops really helps remove the hulls. So that is my overview on watering. I don't think we covered nearly enough there, but it's just really what I'm trying to do there is create some insights into how you need to manage your watering, and understanding how water moves through the soil, and getting to know your soil mixes in that way. Once again, when you're looking for watering advice, it's really important to have all this information about what your soil mix looks like, what the temperature's like, what other growing conditions are like, and that way it's much, much easier to make recommendations on what needs to happen for watering. So I hope that was helpful, and watch for some more videos soon.